Queer-Cripping Anarchism, Intersections and Reflections on Anarchism, Queerness, and Disability, by Liat Ben-Moshe, Anthony J. Nocella II, and A.J. Withers. From the book Queering Anarchism by C.B. Deric, J. Rogue, Deric Shannon, and Abbey Volcano. This text retrieved from theanarchistlibrary.org. Introduction. Anarchism, like feminism, is not a monolithic field. It has many branches, articulations, and frames of thought. However, a few tenets can be identified that are shared by most anarchist thought and practice. These include opposition to any socio-political, economic, or religious hierarchy, domination, and authoritarianism, and support for decentralization and emphasis on freedom and autonomy. Some anarchists also have strong opposition to vanguardism and challenge the intellectual and experiential elitism that is entrenched in academia and in some collectives because of their claim to authority. Throughout this chapter, we aim to demonstrate the relation of disability as formulated by critical disability studies frameworks or disability pedagogy rooted in critical pedagogy to these and other tenets of anarchist thought and practice. We will therefore queer-crip anarchism by providing an analysis that takes disability critically as its analytical tool and asks, what would a just queer-crip world look like? Queerness and disability. The history of an oppressive medical model for homosexuality and disability, and the threat of eugenic extermination by selective abortion, isolations of genes for specific disabilities, or a gay gene, offer additional areas of potential common ground between queer activism and disability activism. The tools of such activism have been quite similar as well, as both queer and disabled activists often use anger, humor, and parody as tools for social change. Another activist connection is a strong debate among activists in both communities of the impetus to assimilate, as opposed to creating their own identity, vocabulary, and safe or accessible spaces. Ableism and heteronormativity are both oppressive ideologies and cultural constructs that hinder the full potential of realizing the scope of human sexuality and modes of being in the world. Ableism is the idea that disability is not just a form of difference, but is an inferior trait, a deficit, an undesirable entity. An ableist society is one that constructs itself in infrastructure such as buildings, curricula, media representations, as if disability does not exist, is repugnant, or needs to be modified in order to fit in the existing order. Heteronormative societies similarly structure themselves as if heterosexuality is not only preferred, but indeed the only mode of living, desiring, and being with others. It is important to emphasize that ableism and heteronormativity are not just analogous, but also intersecting. Not realizing how they work as interlocking oppressions would deny the lived reality of disabled queers who feel marginalized, at times in both communities. One explanation for the exclusion of disability from queer theory and existence, as well as a lack of any effective coalition politics, could be the similar history of medicalization. Queer theory takes back a negative term and articulates gender as a social construction, while understanding the complexity of individual sexual desires. Science in the medical world identified those who are gay or lesbian as disabled and as having a smaller brain, and attempted to prove this through eugenics and other pseudoscientific theories. The historical conceptualization of homosexuality as pathological led to an attempt to normalize it, largely beginning in the 1960s. In 1965, one prominent mainstream gay rights activist, Frank Kemeny, said the entire homophile movement is going to stand or fall on the issue of the medicalization of homosexuality. The lengthy campaign to remove homosexuality as a psychiatric illness was finally successful in 1973, with homosexuality being removed from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Many LGBTQ folks today may want to distance themselves from any community that has been medicalized in similar ways, in order to cut off the historical ties to notions of pathology and abnormality. This process has been well described by Bainton, who demonstrates how throughout history, disability has been used not only as a justification for excluding disabled people, but also to exclude other marginal groups, people of color, immigrants, by attributing disability to them. The marked groups usually do not question the assumption that underpin disability as inferior, but instead try to distance themselves from the disability label by scientific means if possible. This resistance to allying queer communities with disabled ones is not only cumbersome to the realization of shared ideals in coalition politics, but it is also detrimental to the lives of disabled queers. Because disabled people are perceived as asexual and/or sexually inferior to non-disabled, except in fetishized communities like amputee devotee or dwarf fetish, being queer may seem like a logical step, since being gay is also regarded as an inferior sexual form by heterosexual people and heteronormative cultures. Not only are the lived experiences of queerness and disability parallel, but their theorizations are as well. Disability studies and queer theory can be regarded as critical and liberating discourses. Critical of the social constructions of heteronormativity and normalcy, the 4 Ds of disability criminology, demonizing delinquency, deviance, and dissent, similarly critique how these labels stigmatize marginalized groups, including queers and those with disabilities. Queer-Cripping. Of course, queerness and disability are not just similar as identities and theories, but also are inextricably interconnected. Queer theory's subject of interrogation has been the compulsory nature of heteronormativity. Scholars in disability studies, such as Robert McGruer and Leonard Davis, suggest that disability studies should be normalcy studies instead. McGruer's Crip theory's aim is to, quote, continuously invoke, in order to further the crisis, the inadequate resolutions that compulsory heterosexuality and compulsory able-bodiedness offer us. End quote. Crip is used here as a reclaimed word, used both as a verb and as an identity of those who embody it, that resist the negative connotations of disability that have been bestowed upon it by an ableist culture. Crip theory, McGruer argues, will, quote, draw attention to critically queer, severely disabled possibilities in order to bring to the fore the Crip actors who will exacerbate in more productive ways the crisis of authority that currently besets heterosexual and able-bodied norms. End quote. By severely disabled, McGruer is not referring to the level of impairment a person is presumed to have, but rather as a queer position. By reclaiming severe as fierce or defiant, McGruer versus able-bodied standards that view severe disabilities as ones that will never be integrated to the circuit, the adage of everyone should be included except for. From their marginal state, severe disabilities and queer subjects are positioned to re-enter the margins and point to the inadequacies of straight and non-disabled assumptions. McGruer not only claims that the norms and the subjects they produce are connected or interlocking, but also that they are dependent on each other. Each normative framework cannot function, i.e., is disabled, without the other. Compulsory heterosexuality only operates as it does because of presumed able-bodiedness of its subjects, and vice versa. For instance, heterosexuality is not assumed for disabled Crip folks, as they are often perceived as asexual. In the same token, queerness is perceived as a disability from a heteronormative framework. Such an analysis goes beyond understanding the connections between queerness and disability as identities, i.e., the lived experience of queer Crips, in a move that both de-essentializes these identities, as queering and cripping are used as verbs, not mere identities, and tries to grapple with their full existence, materially and imaginarily. Carrie Sandall further suggests that, quote, both queering and cripping expose the arbitrary delineation between normal and defective and the negative social ramifications of attempts to homogenize humanity, end quote. Hence the term queer crip or queer cripping. Both queer and crip open up areas for conversation and imagination that are closed off by the cultural imperialism of the idea of normalcy. According to Robert McClure and Abbey Wilkerson, quote, a queer crip consciousness is about desiring more, about developing and defending public cultures in which we do not necessarily stand united. A queer crip consciousness resists containment and imagines other, more inventive, expansive, and just communities. End quote. Because queer Crips cannot live in the world as is, a queer Crip consciousness imagines a new world order. At its very core, disability destabilizes identity and escapes any neat categorizations. Disability is fluid and contextual rather than biological. This does not mean that biology does not play out in our minds and bodies, but that the definition of disability is imposed upon certain kinds of minds and bodies. Those of you who are reading this chapter with your glasses on perhaps do not identify with disability or crip culture, but you would be quite disabled without your visual aids. It is also a truism that we will all experience some kind of disability if we live long enough. But more than that, disability, if understood as constructed through historical and cultural processes, should be seen not as a binary, but as a continuum. One is always disabled in relation to the context in which one is put. A person has a learning disability if put in a scholarly setting. Using a wheelchair becomes a disability and a disadvantage when the environment is inaccessible. Someone who wears glasses may be disabled without them when attempting to read written language or see far away. But this can change depending on the context that they are seeing and being seen within. The definition of disability and ability shifts depending on what the needs of those at the top of hierarchical structures dictate. The state commonly defines disability loosely when that definition is used to marginalize people, and more rigidly when it is used to determine access to resources. As a fluid state, disability, much like queerness, should be perceived as a normal state of affairs. Imagining the world through a queer crip lens, then, aids and challenges the forms of hierarchy and domination by challenging the very idea of normalcy. A queer-cripped anarchism would resist the hierarchies that permit the imposition of disabled identities on minds and bodies that are considered deviant as an integral component to resisting domination and achieving autonomy. This differs from Marxist thought, which is centered more on resistance to exploitation and appropriation. Construction of normalcy. Normalcy is a relatively new concept, which arose as part of the modernity project in 1800 to 1850 in Western Europe and its North American colonized spaces. The word normal did not enter the English language until around 1840. Prior to the concept of normalcy, there was a concept of the ideal, and its corollary, the grotesque. In Roman Greek culture, it was understood that everyone falls beneath its standard. The ideal was perceived as unachievable, and imperfection was on a continuum, like a Greek statue. Imperfection was seen as being on various degrees from the ideal and was not penalized as such. In the 19th century, the concept of the norm entered European culture, as related to the concept of the average. Normalcy began with the creation of measurements and statistics. Qualities are represented on a bell curve, and the extremes of the curve are abnormal. Statistics were created as state tools, hence their etymology as statistics, with the advent of modernity, as political arithmetic. It is hard to imagine that before 1820, political bodies did not make decisions solely based on crime, poverty, birth, death, and unemployment rates. This new form of governance is what Foucault characterized as biopolitics, the newfound ability to measure performances of individuals and groups that makes them governable. Davis states that there is a difference between normalcy and normality, in which normality is the actual state of being normal or being regarded as normal, and normalcy is the structural realm that controls and normalized bodies. It is the ideology behind normality. This ideology is embedded with bourgeois and, of course, white heterosexual and male norms, in which the middle class is seen as the mean. This ideology, claims Davis, quote, can be seen as developing the kind of science that would then justify the notions of the norm. End quote. These norms also centered on the body and its performance. The key argument Davis makes is that ableism and normalization are not unusual practices that we must denounce, but are part of the modernist project by definition. The creation of modern nation states, democracy, measurement in science, capitalism. There are several paradoxes associated with modernism. Representational democracy versus individual representation, capitalism versus equality, etc. Normalcy as an ideology seemingly resolves these conflicts. In regards to wealth, on a curve it is clear that not all can be wealthy. Some have to be in the margins of the curve for capitalism to be sustained. Equality under these parameters is not morally or ethically defined, but rather scientifically. So, many people fight for equality, but what we should be fighting for is diversity and respect of differences. The concept of the norm, unlike the ideal, implies that the majority of the population must somehow be around the mean. Everyone has to work hard to conform to norms, but people with disabilities and other marginalized groups are scapegoated for not being able to fit these standards, while in fact they are needed to create these standards and maintain them. There is a need for people at the margin, but they are punished for being placed there. As an example for such punitive ideology, Davis analyzes the interesting fact that almost all the early statisticians, Galton, Pearson, and others, were also known eugenicists. It is not surprising, perhaps, since the notion of the norm and the average divided the population into standard and substandard populations. Difference is thus projected onto stigmatized populations, so all others can strive for the elusive normalcy. Disability is not based on a binary, but a multinary. It is an understanding that all are different. Queer-cripping is thus a premier lens through which to fight against normalcy, average, standardization, and conformity. Queer-cripping, as an analytical lens, as well as a lived experience, can offer insights into the ways historical and cultural formations, such as labor, productivity, and dependence, can be interrogated. It offers a radical critique of work as a practice and a concept which goes well beyond labor politics. Global capitalism is forcing us to become as efficient as possible. Marx and subsequent traditions identified people based on class rather than other particular identities, such as race, gender, sex, age, ability, etc., and were only interested in the concept of class struggle and no other modes of power beyond an economic influence. An anarchist framework that centers on the rejection of domination will do well by going beyond a class-based analysis into an interrogation of all forms of power that subjugate us and simultaneously separate us from each other. Queer-crip resistance to capitalism. Capitalist ideology creates and reproduces a disciplinary world in which people conform to a particular hegemonic set of values and patterns of thought. Shallow equality, as contrasted with radical equality, as identified by Ben-Moshe, Hill, Nocella, and Templer, normality and being average seem so ingrained that most people take them as neutral terms that have always guided our ways of living and thinking, and as a taken-for-granted way of creating social hierarchies. Under a neo-Marxist analysis, disability is an ideology upon which the capitalist system rests. A disability ideology can regulate and control the unequal distribution of surplus by invoking biological difference as the natural cause of inequality. Charlton sees disabled people as surplus population, those who don't even serve as part of what Marx termed the reserve army of labor, a resource tapped into during economic expansion or crisis. They are essentially the underclass. The definition of unemployment itself historically excludes disabled people, undocumented immigrants, retired people who often wish to work, and women who do unpaid labor. One strategy used by post-industrial nations to maintain certain rates of unemployment is to categorize people to be clients of the human service industry, such as therapists, social workers, nurses, case managers, paid assistants, evaluators, special educators, etc., and thus to keep them out of the labor force, by creating and maintaining the jobs as service providers at the same time. Work is central to industrial societies, not only as means of obtaining life's necessities, but also to establish certain kinds of relations with others. Industrialization not only posed a problem for disabled people to participate in the workforce, which now required greater speed, stamina, and rigid production norms, but also excluded disability as a culture. Disabled people had increasingly found themselves marginalized within segregated settings, such as institutions and special education. Disabled people mark, with their different bodies and minds, the boundaries of normalcy. They serve as an ideological reminder of the fate of those who do not participate in the capitalist production. The notion of disability is so intertwined with perceived inability to work that if a person is able to work, they cannot be regarded as disabled. According to Social Security, for instance, all societies function through principles that distribute goods and services amongst the entire population. Stone argues that in capitalist societies, the major mechanism of distribution is work done, but not all are willing or able to work. Therefore, a second distributive mechanism is established, which is based on need. With the rise of capitalism, disability became the category through which people are measured as need-based or work-based. Such analyses, which emphasize a political economy lens, dispel the common belief that people with disabilities are not productive under the capitalist system, since they do not hold jobs. Many, including policymakers, believe that disabled people are a strain on the economy, especially under neoliberal ideology. But political economists argue that disability supports a whole industry of professionals that keeps the economy afloat, such as service providers, case managers, medical professionals, healthcare specialists, etc. The human service industry and healthcare professionals have to keep people in need of their services and keep them dependent upon these services. Beginning in the 1980s, healthcare consumer became interchangeable with consumer. Nancy Tomes argues that the use of the term consumer is a violation, and it imposes, quote, the base language of the marketplace to the sacred realm of the doctor-patient relationship, end quote. According to Tomes, patients initiated the use of the consumer language in the 1960s and 1970s because they viewed it as, quote, a liberating alternative to the traditional doctor-patient relationship they believed to be hopelessly mired in paternalism, end quote. The adoption of the term consumer has, however, not eliminated medical paternalism. The concept of disabled people as consumers, mental health consumer, the Consumer Advocacy and Advisory Committee for Persons with Disabilities, etc., remains predominant. With respect to disability organizations self-labeling as consumer organizations, this is generally done to have business and industry recognize disabled people as an important market. The name and the organizational approach exclude many poor disabled people who do not have the funds to vote with their dollars. It is highly problematic to call individuals who are forced into treatment by the state consumers. Many psychiatrized people are forced to take medication, undergo electroshock therapy, or to reside in institutions. For many, forced psychiatric treatment is not a service that people consume. It is a violation of their autonomy, and it is abuse. De Jong, who is known as one of the formulators of the independent living movement, accused that movement of being entrenched in ideals of radical consumerism, as they relate to people with disabilities. The movement is deeply wedded to capitalist ideals such as self-reliance, political freedom, and consumer sovereignty, in the same vein as critics heard in the LGBT movement. From self-identified queers, for instance, the conceptualization of the movement as consumer-driven is beneficial to a small section of its constituency, mainly middle-class white American men. A hope for an interdependent, collaborative mutual aid. This article, written by 3 authors, is Disability Anarchism in Action, stressing interdependency on assisting each other on editing, concepts, theory, and writing. Collaboration is interdependency in action, while the concept of mutual aid is more of a macro socio-political and economic system to build community and relationships. Mutual aid is a core tenet of anarchism. Much of the anarchist tradition rejects the ideology of individualism and focuses on mutual aid, or in queer-crip language, interdependence. Within some anarchist communities, mutual aid has been put into practice specifically to support their disabled members. In Toronto, where AJ lives and participates in queer collectives, both as a recipient and a supporter, a number of care collectives have been established to support disabled people. The longest running of these collectives has been operating for about 6 years and has provided 3 to 4 half-hour to hour-long shifts a day. None of these shifts are paid, and none of them are established out of charity. They were created and continue to function with the acknowledgement of the contributions that the disabled people make to community and the desire to build mutual support. The notion of radical access, as proposed by some disabled activists, also calls on the ideas of mutual aid. Griffin Epstein explains that, quote, access means paying attention to the actual needs of actual people, keeping in mind histories and legacies of oppression, end quote. Radical access calls for a collective negotiation of needs within communities, including sign language interpretation, attendant care, physical barriers, emotional support, financial support, child care, etc., as well as fundamental social changes that would lead to the fair and just distribution of resources. If disability studies and activism could offer a corrective to the anarchist practice of mutual reliance, it would be to the concept of DIY, including anarcho-primitivism, which is DIY culture taken to an extreme. There seems to be a growing literature, especially in what has come to be called green anarchism, which focuses on self-reliance and a return to nature. This politic requires a non-disabled body for its ideal society. Chalice Glendinning writes of lean hunter-gatherer women who endure strenuous demands of walking long distances while carrying equipment, mounds of plant food, and children, physical conditions that are reproduced among today's female athletes. Such calls will have devastating effects on the lives of disabled people who truly embody a spirit of mutual aid every day by relying on personal assistance, friends, and family members to achieve independence and autonomy, which are also core practices of anarchism. Through a queer crip lens, we should perhaps focus more on DIT, do it together. The focus on independence, we would argue, is an adoption of capitalist values. Capitalism asserts an ideology of independence and emphasizes relationships and interactions for which there are economic transactions. This ideology, however, is a lie, as all of us are interdependent and rely on each other not only for our food, shelter, and clothing, but also for our emotional, physical, and intellectual needs. Shifting focus from DIY to DIT reasserts our collectivity and interdependence, and rejects the focus on rugged individualism, a value that negates many people's needs for care. Enabling politics. Engaging in prefigurative politics in relation to a queer crip existence entails rethinking inclusivity. The knee-jerk types of anarchist organizing and activism are often quite exclusive spaces and enterprises. For instance, many radical conferences and actions lack attention to basic accessibility, such as interpreters, note-takers, and accessible bathrooms and entranceways. For example, one anarchist book fair in Toronto was held up a long, narrow flight of stairs. The argument for it being inaccessible was that it had to be in an anarchist-friendly space. Their definition of anarchist-friendly excluded people who could not scale a flight of stairs. It is also becoming a kind of ironic truism that whenever there is resistance, there is a march, although a march or an organized protest may yield some visibility to the cause and create solidarity among its participants. It is also a quite exclusionary resistance strategy for many disabled activists. As such, it can be as polarizing as it is galvanizing around a particular issue. Queer-cripping political organizing requires recognition of the intersectionality of marginalized identities and a shift toward coalitional politics and inclusive strategies and tactics. An example is the anti-G20 organizing in Toronto in 2010. As the organizing for the protest got underway, an accessibility strategy was implemented that required every aspect of the organizing to make things as accessible as possible and to report on progress to the broader organization. It worked to supply attendant care, accessible housing, and accessible transportation throughout the days of protest. In conclusion, social justice cannot be achieved without proper representation by and inclusion of queer and disabled communities. But the contributions of a queer crip analysis and queer crip communities are not solely about inclusion. Queer crip perspectives work to push anarchist politics forward in directions that anarchism has failed to go historically. Queer-cripping anarchism works to fill some of the gaps of anarchist history, to address its omissions, and to undo its ableist assumptions. We recognize that the work in transforming anarchism is and will continue to be slow. However, for those of us concerned with social justice, it is our responsibility to do this work.